What is horror? And I don't mean this, or this, or this, or even this. I mean this. What is the word horror? And more importantly, why do we use it to describe all of those? The word horror comes from the Latin horrere, literally meaning to stand up on end as in hair or to tremble as in with fear. The specific trembling part of this definition was carried through French and then English in the 13th and 14th century and meant generally to shake or shiver from the cold or from fear. Eventually it transformed from a symptom to the cause of said shivering and shaking, or a thing that brings terror. However, it was only in 1931 that the word was coined to describe the genre of horror. Nowadays, a lot of writers don't like the word horror. They think it's too lurid or constricting or vague and prefer to use terms like dark fantasy or gothic or psychological thriller. But to the general public, horror is widely known to be a literary genre of fiction that is intended to disturb, frighten or scare. And that genre will always be labelled, at least as an umbrella term, as horror. So why am I questioning such an ingrained way to describe stories? Well, while horror has become widely known as a genre, its specific definition as a feeling has remained. Google defines it as an intense feeling of fear, shock, or disgust. Now, horror, the genre, doesn't necessarily intend to incite the feeling of horror. It intends to incite fear, and horror is just an aspect of said fear. So essentially, my theory is that we should take the words horror and fear and flip them. Does that make any sense?
Nope.
Think about it. The name for a genre should be a non-specific term describing its style, and the names for the feelings we get from said genres should be specific and telling. And yet, horror is a very specific term, and fear is a generalization for a whole range of different emotions. Why do we use each for their opposite function? Now, if there's anything that uni has taught me, is that you need to define your terms, and also how to be £30,000 in debt to the government. So what do I actually mean by horror? And what do I actually mean by fear? I know it seems nitpicky to analyze them so closely, but I think it's pretty important. Obviously, I don't think I'm better than anyone who uses these very widely known terms without defining them every time. I'm, of course, guilty of generalization, a trait I share with everyone else in the universe. But let's look a little closer. There are three groups of fear: before an event, during an event, and after an event. I like to refer to these as the dread stage, the terror stage, and the horror stage. Good horror media will evoke all three. The dread stage encompasses strong worry, anxiety, and paranoia, all of which are distinct from each other. These are the feelings you get before anything has happened, when you're playing a horror game and are stopping constantly to listen out for that faint creak you're sure you heard. When you're watching a horror film where a character enters a tight space you know they can't easily escape from. The terror stage encompasses shock, panic, and desperation. This is during some sort of scary event, the most manic, hectic kind of fear. When Michael Myers starts to break down the closet door in Halloween, when the xenomorph sprints at you in Alien Isolation. The quick transition from shock to panic often leads, to use hyperbole slightly, a desperate kind of terror. And the horror stage is the one that's the most important to us. Horror comes after. It's the feeling that sets in when there's no danger and when the terror fades. It's disgust, shell shock, the feeling of being completely disturbed by something you've seen or read. When Ellison watches the Lawn Work 86 or Pool Party 66 or Family Hanging Out 11 tapes in Sinister, or when the chestburster rips through Kane's chest in Alien, or more accurately, the time just after these moments. This is horror to me. It's that lasting impression of watching something that is in some way disturbing. A lot of the time through a combination of gore, performance, sound design, visuals, or just pure subject matter. To me, it's encapsulated by the Family Hanging Out tape in Sinister. I've never forgotten the sounds, the visuals, the very idea of what's happening. But horror also can't be overused. Usually, a real true moment of horror only happens a few times in any singular piece of media. Otherwise, it will just lose its ability to move you in any way. Now, these stages are obviously not happening completely separate from one another. Often they come hand in hand. In the most simplified terms, they can be seen as a cycle, whether that cycle takes place over a matter of hours or a matter of seconds. Dread comes first, then terror, then horror. but of course they bleed into each other. There are so many ways that the concept of this cycle can be applied to analysis. For example, a jump scare will often include the dread stage in some capacity, and then the terror stage in the form of shock, but often not the horror stage. Not organically building up that dread stage and not including that horror stage is often why jump scares can be seen as cheap. Alternatively, a good scare will focus on the connection between dread and terror. Instead of making the terror stage predictable,
"What are you doing in my home?" That was a pretty good game, actually.
Or completely unpredictable, i.e. a random, useless jump scare, it should be subversive but logically sound.
See? Everything's okay.
Alright, I'm going off on a tangent, but let's bring it back around. We've established that horror is a specific stage of fear, so why do we generalize the entire genre as horror? Should we call the genre fear? Maybe a non-specific term, maybe terror, the most universal of the stages? Something even more out of the box? I know it sounds strange on the surface, but over time we'd probably get used to that name change. Certainly any of those would be more accurate than horror. Or would they? Nope. Let's talk about why horror actually is the best word for it. If some of the things I've said in this video sound familiar, that might be because a lot of it is inspired from Orson Scott Card's Maps in a Mirror collection. Card talks all about these stages. He argues that dread is the strongest kind of fear. It's the only stage which tackles the unknown, and our minds can craft far greater horrors than can physically exist in the pages of a book or on screen. So why don't we call the genre dread? Well, despite being the strongest kind of fear, it seems strange to name the entire genre after the concept of build-up. What's more, both terror and dread exist in other genres very frequently. So what is so unique about the horror stage? Everyone seems to agree that it's the weakest out of the three. Certainly it's the stage which tackles the unknown the least. What's more, a lot of scary media that rely on horror can be seen as fairly cheap, like The Human Centipede and its lack of dread and terror. And yet, horror still matters the most. Let me explain this in 3 points. Number 1. Horror distinguishes the genre from others. The most obvious point is that dread and terror exist in other genres, but the feeling of horror is specific to the genre of horror. And yes, this entire video could have just been that one sentence and been basically accurate. It's more of a thinking exercise. Action will have suspense, verging on dread, and science fiction will have intense unfamiliarity, perhaps verging on terror. But the horror element is less central in other genres. They don't intend to disturb or disgust as their main goals, with some exceptions. 2. It's the most difficult to get right. Yeah, there's other reasons why it's the most important stage of fear when it comes to the genre. It's the most difficult. To achieve true horror, something that really sticks with people is hard. And like I and Orson Scott Card have said, it's very easy to overuse. Those feelings of nausea and pity and revulsion might lead you to reject the humanity of the scene. And too much of this will dehumanize the characters or the victims completely. As a creative, you need to hold off until the moment is right. And this particular art is what makes horror so significant. When it comes down to it, the horror stage is what distinguishes good, solid horror from poorly done horror. Number 3. The end feeling is what sticks with you. And finally, one of the main reasons I wanted to make this video, and one of the main reasons I think horror is so special. The experience of viewing a film shouldn't end once the credits roll, nor that of playing a game once you achieve your goal, nor that of reading a book when you turn the final page. Something, whatever that may be, should stick with you. When you consume horror media, it isn't the dread or the terror that stays with you. It's the horror. It's the mutilated body of the last victim. It's the horrifying twist of fate that chills you to your core. It's the hair-raising brutality of an ending which leaves you utterly speechless. That is why it's called horror. For all my misgivings and theories, I truly believe it is absolutely the correct word for such a special genre. So in conclusion, there are 3 stages of fear: dread, terror, and horror. Despite the details of which is the scariest or which is the most common, horror is the one that defines the genre. Thank you for watching. Sorry if any of that was misleading. I know I went down a few different routes with it. If you want to explore more, I really do recommend reading the introduction to that Orson Scott Card collection, Maps in a Mirror. It's the introduction is the bit that talks about all the stuff I've mentioned. So please leave a comment. I'd like to have discussions in the comments. It's a lot of fun. And yeah, bye.